Just remember that you're the prize always.
Say that one more time.
Just remember that you are the prize.
Yes.
That's like his golden slogan for me.
Yeah.
How difficult has it been to see Lori date now?
It's hard, man. I ain't even gonna lie, it's hard. I've had to swallow some things, and I feel for her.
What if I told you that Hollywood's most perfect love story was never perfect at all? What if behind the red carpets, luxury vacations, and carefully curated Instagram smiles, there was a completely different narrative being whispered in private rooms, encrypted messages, and late-night studio deals? Because tonight, Michael B. Jordan has finally broken his silence. And according to insiders, what he's about to reveal about Lori Harvey isn't just messy, it's industry-shaking. We're talking about a world where reputations are built like movie sets, beautiful from the outside, but hollow behind the walls. Where one name can open every door, and one rumor can shut them all just as fast. But here's the question everyone is suddenly asking. Was Lori Harvey really the rising Hollywood darling the media painted her to be? Or was she something entirely different behind closed doors? And more importantly, why is Michael B. Jordan speaking now, after staying silent for so long? Because if even half of what's being whispered in entertainment circles is true, then this isn't just a breakup story. This is a full-scale Hollywood unraveling. And trust me, you're not ready for where this goes next. The moment Michael B. Jordan stepped out of that blacked-out SUV outside the downtown studio lot, something immediately felt off. Not because of cameras, not because of paparazzi, but because Michael B. Jordan himself looked like a man who had finally stopped rehearsing his life. For years, he had been Hollywood's definition of controlled chaos. The kind of actor who could smile in interviews, laugh at award shows, and still somehow say absolutely nothing meaningful about his personal life. But tonight was different. There was no smile, no PR polish, no carefully curated silence. Just a man walking straight into a storm he had allegedly avoided for years. And the reason for that storm, according to every whisper circulating inside the industry right now, is one name: Lori Harvey. Now, Lori Harvey is not new to Hollywood conversations. She never really has been. She entered the industry the way most people only enter dreams, suddenly, loudly, and with every camera somehow already pointed in her direction. One moment she was attending private industry events, the next she was sitting front row at premieres that people spent decades trying to access. But the question that always followed her wasn't about talent. It wasn't about acting range or career trajectory. It was always about access. How did she move so fast through a system where even established names struggle for visibility? Why did her name appear in circles that didn't usually mix with rising talent? And most importantly, why did every major shift in her public presence seem to coincide with a new high-profile connection? Hollywood never says things directly. It hints. It suggests. It lets silence do the talking. And in Lori Harvey's case, silence had been doing a lot of talking for a long time. Michael B. Jordan, on the other hand, was supposed to be different. He built his image on discipline, on distance, on refusing to play the typical celebrity game. While others posted their lives, Michael B. Jordan guarded his like it was classified material. That was part of his appeal. The mystery. The idea that he was above the noise. But mysteries in Hollywood never stay intact forever. The first crack appeared months ago during a low-profile film festival appearance where Michael B. Jordan and Lori Harvey were spotted leaving the same private after-party. At the time, it was dismissed as coincidence. Industry people often end up in the same rooms. The explanation was easy, convenient, forgettable. Until it wasn't. Because shortly after that, Lori Harvey's public visibility began shifting in a very specific pattern. Not disappearing, not exploding, but adjusting. Selective appearances. Carefully timed sightings. Strategic silence followed by sudden bursts of attention. And Michael B. Jordan. He started doing something even more unusual. He stopped attending events he had already confirmed. Interviews were delayed. Press appearances quietly removed from schedules. It wasn't a disappearance, but it was definitely a retreat. That's when the first wave of speculation began. And speculation in Hollywood is never harmless. At first, it was framed as a possible creative collaboration. A secret project. A method actor disappearing into preparation. That version was comforting. Easy to digest. But insiders started telling a different story. Anonymous assistants. Low-level production staff. People who are always close enough to hear things but never important enough to be named. They started mentioning tension. Meetings that ended abruptly. Conversations that stopped when people entered rooms. A noticeable shift in Michael B. Jordan's tone whenever Lori Harvey's name came up on set discussions. One production crew member allegedly described it like this: "It didn't feel like drama. It felt like damage control that hadn't fully formed yet." And that's when Hollywood does what it always does best. It waits for the fracture to widen. By the time Michael B. Jordan arrived at the studio lot tonight, that fracture had already turned into a headline-shaped void. Nobody knew what he was about to say, but everyone knew why he was finally saying something. Because silence, in this industry, is never neutral. It is always temporary. And when it breaks, it usually breaks loudly. Inside the studio, security had been tightened in a way that immediately caught attention. Extra personnel. Restricted access zones. Phones allegedly being checked at entry points. Something that never happens unless someone wants total narrative control. And then Michael B. Jordan entered the room. No press conference set up. No formal backdrop. Just a controlled seating arrangement, dim lighting, and a silence so heavy it almost felt staged. He didn't start with greetings. He didn't start with gratitude. He didn't even start with context. He started with a pause. And that pause did more damage than any statement could have. Because in that pause, everyone in the room understood the same thing at the same time. This wasn't promotional. This wasn't damage control. This was exposure. Michael B. Jordan finally leaned forward, hands clasped, eyes fixed somewhere between exhaustion and decision. And what he said next would immediately shift the entire narrative around Lori Harvey from celebrity gossip to full-scale industry controversy. But before he even got there, he made one thing clear. "This isn't about revenge," he said quietly. Which, in Hollywood language, almost always means the opposite. And just like that, the room shifted. Because now it wasn't a question of whether something happened. It was a question of how much of it was going to come out. And more importantly, who else was involved. At this point, according to multiple insiders monitoring the situation in real time, certain names began circulating privately among studio executives. Yes, publicly. Yes, officially. But in the way names circulate when people are already preparing contingency plans. Lori Harvey's name was at the center of it all. But she wasn't alone in the conversation anymore. Because once Michael B. Jordan opens a door like this, it rarely stays limited to one person. It expands. It pulls in networks. It connects timelines that were never meant to be connected publicly. And what started as a quiet, controlled industry relationship story was now beginning to resemble something far more complicated. A system story. A visibility story. A story about how fast someone can rise in Hollywood when the right people are watching, and how quickly that same system can turn when the narrative shifts. And Michael B. Jordan, sitting under those dim studio lights, looked like a man who had finally decided that whatever consequences came next were no longer his priority. He adjusted the microphone slightly, and said the first sentence that officially changed everything. But what he revealed next didn't just target Lori Harvey. It started pulling threads that the entire room wasn't ready to follow. And that's where things escalated far beyond what anyone expected. Because the real story wasn't just about who Lori Harvey was seen with. It was about who was watching her rise, and why. And by the time Michael B. Jordan finished his opening statement, one thing became clear to everyone in that room. This was only the beginning. Michael B. Jordan didn't immediately continue after that first statement. Instead, he leaned back slightly, as if measuring how much of the room was still with him. The silence had shifted now. It was no longer passive silence. It was anticipatory silence. The kind that leans forward before the audience even realizes it. Somewhere in the back of the room, a pen dropped. It sounded louder than it should have. Michael B. Jordan glanced briefly in that direction but didn't react further. Instead, he continued. What people don't understand about Hollywood is that nothing ever really starts when it becomes public. By the time something reaches cameras, it has already lived multiple lives behind closed doors. Conversations, corrections, warnings, quiet exits from rooms, and subtle changes in who is allowed access to what. And according to Michael B. Jordan, that was exactly where Lori Harvey's story became complicated. He didn't describe her as a villain. He didn't describe her as a victim either. That was what made his tone unsettling. It was detached, almost observational, like he was describing a system rather than a person. He claimed that early in their interactions, everything looked normal on the surface. Industry events, shared professional circles, occasional overlapping appearances. Nothing that would raise concern on its own. But patterns, he said, are not visible in moments. They only appear in repetition. And repetition was what he kept noticing. Certain names appearing in the same spaces. Certain introductions that didn't match typical career progression paths. Certain invitations that seemed too specific, too targeted, almost as if they were part of a larger structure that operated quietly beneath public-facing Hollywood. At this point, Michael B. Jordan paused again. He clarified something important. He said this wasn't about personal judgment. It was about observation. That line alone immediately changed the energy in the room, because it reframed everything from emotional accusation to structural critique. But even then, the implication was obvious. He was suggesting that Hollywood isn't just an industry. It's a network of controlled visibility. And in that network, some people rise through traditional routes, while others are placed into visibility streams that operate very differently. Lori Harvey, according to Michael B. Jordan, was someone whose visibility never followed a standard pattern. That's when the first wave of reactions started building outside the room. Social media had already begun reacting to fragments of the statement. Clips without context. Quotes taken out of sequence. Headlines forming faster than the full story could even be understood. Some users called it exposure. Others called it deflection. Some dismissed the entire thing as another manufactured Hollywood distraction. But inside the room, Michael B. Jordan was still speaking. He shifted slightly forward again and mentioned something that immediately changed the tone. He referred to structured introductions within the industry. The idea that certain rising figures are not simply discovered, but positioned. That their entry points into high visibility spaces are not accidental, but strategically timed. He didn't name anyone else directly, but he didn't need to. The implication alone was enough to trigger tension among those present. One executive reportedly leaned toward another and whispered something, though no one recorded what was said. Security presence increased subtly near the exits, not dramatically, but enough to be noticeable to anyone paying attention. Michael B. Jordan continued. He said there were moments where professional boundaries became unclear. Not in a sensational way, but in a logistical one. Meetings that included people who weren't officially part of a project. Conversations that referenced opportunities that hadn't been publicly announced. Shifts in decision-making that didn't follow expected channels. And at the center of those patterns, he kept noticing the same recurring name structure tied to Lori Harvey's career trajectory. Not direct accusations. Not direct claims. Just a pattern being described out loud for the first time. Then came the turning point. Michael B. Jordan stated that there was a moment when he personally questioned the environment he was operating in. Not because of public perception, but because of internal inconsistencies he could no longer ignore. He described it as a realization that certain parts of Hollywood don't operate on transparency, but on curated proximity. Who is seen with whom, who is introduced to whom, and who is quietly removed from conversations without any public explanation. At this point, the narrative had shifted completely. This was no longer about a single individual. It had become a commentary on the machinery of the industry itself. But the audience was still waiting for Lori Harvey's name to fully re-enter the frame in a direct way. Michael B. Jordan eventually addressed that expectation without actually fulfilling it in the way people expected. He said, carefully, that Lori Harvey was not the only person affected by this system. She was, in his words, a visible point within a much larger invisible structure. That statement alone caused visible reactions across the room. Some journalists began typing faster. Others stopped typing entirely, realizing they might be missing the bigger angle. Outside, the narrative had already started mutating again. Some outlets were framing it as a breakup fallout story. Others as an industry whistleblowing moment. Others were calling it strategic publicity ahead of an upcoming project. But Michael B. Jordan hadn't mentioned any project. And that absence was part of what made the situation more unstable. He then addressed his own role in the situation. He admitted that he stayed silent longer than he should have. Not out of fear, he said, but out of uncertainty about how to even categorize what he was seeing. Because in Hollywood, he explained, ambiguity is often safer than clarity. Clarity forces responses. Ambiguity allows continuation. But eventually, ambiguity becomes its own form of pressure. And that pressure, according to Michael B. Jordan, had reached a point where remaining silent was no longer neutral. He didn't say he was exposing anything definitive. He said he was finally acknowledging patterns that he could no longer unsee. Then came the sentence that shifted everything again. He said that certain relationships in Hollywood are not purely personal, nor purely professional, but operate in a hybrid space where influence, access, and visibility overlap in ways the public rarely understands. And once those systems are acknowledged, he said, it becomes impossible to pretend they don't exist. At that moment, the tone of the entire room changed again. Because now it wasn't about Lori Harvey specifically. It was about what her presence represented within a much broader ecosystem. And ecosystems don't collapse from one point. They destabilize from multiple connected nodes. Michael B. Jordan looked down briefly, then back up. He said he understood the reaction this would create. He expected it. But he also made it clear that he was no longer interested in controlling interpretation. That statement alone was effectively a release of narrative control. And in Hollywood, releasing narrative control is equivalent to opening a door and walking away from it. As the session began to approach its end, Michael B. Jordan didn't offer closure. He didn't summarize. He didn't soften anything. Instead, he left the audience with a final thought that felt more like a warning than a conclusion. He said that the industry always reacts loudly to what is said publicly, but the real shifts happen quietly afterward, in boardrooms, in contracts, and in decisions that never make headlines. And then he stopped speaking. No dramatic exit. No final glance. Just silence. But that silence felt different now. It wasn't unresolved. It was loaded. Because everyone in that room understood something very clearly at that point. Whatever Michael B. Jordan had just initiated was not ending here. It was transitioning. And whatever came next would no longer be contained within one conversation, one studio, or one name. It was already moving beyond that. And Lori Harvey's name, whether directly or indirectly, was now permanently attached to a narrative that had just begun expanding in ways no one could fully control anymore. And that is where everything started shifting into its next phase. By the time Michael B. Jordan left the studio that night, the atmosphere outside had already changed in a way that no official statement could control. It wasn't chaos yet, but it was the early stage of something worse, interpretation. Reporters weren't shouting questions in the traditional sense. They were calling out fragments of what they thought they had just heard inside. Clips were already circulating online, stitched together, slowed down, zoomed in, dissected frame by people who weren't even in the room. And the strange part was that everyone seemed to be watching a slightly different version of the same event. Inside the industry, the reaction was even more layered. Executives weren't reacting to Michael B. Jordan's words emotionally. They were reacting structurally. Phones were being made calls on, meetings were being quietly scheduled, and a few projects that had previously been stable were suddenly under review without any public explanation. That is how Hollywood usually reacts. Not loudly. Quietly, in adjustments that never get announced. Meanwhile, Lori Harvey's name had entered a different phase of visibility. Not increased visibility, not decreased visibility, but unstable visibility. The kind where every mention carries a different tone depending on who is speaking. Some narratives painted her as misunderstood. Others framed her as strategically positioned. Others simply refused to mention her at all, which in Hollywood is often more meaningful than criticism. But what changed everything wasn't what Michael B. Jordan said. It was what he didn't clarify. Because ambiguity spreads faster than facts. 2 days after the studio appearance, Michael B. Jordan's team released a short statement. It was carefully worded, deliberately neutral. It clarified nothing and redirected everything. It said the remarks were observational in nature and not intended as direct commentary on any individual's personal life. In other words, it confirmed nothing, but also didn't retract anything. And that was enough for the narrative to continue growing on its own. Lori Harvey, on the other hand, did what high-profile figures often do in moments like this. She didn't respond immediately. She didn't engage directly. She maintained silence, which in modern celebrity culture is no longer seen as absence, but as strategy. But silence has its own consequences. Because when one side speaks in fragments and the other side stays quiet, the public fills in the gaps. And the gaps were filled quickly. Online discussions turned Michael B. Jordan's comments into theories. Some claimed he was hinting at systemic industry dynamics. Others insisted it was a personal fallout being reframed as something larger. A few even turned it into a conspiracy narrative involving multiple overlapping careers and influence networks. None of these interpretations could be verified, but verification was no longer the point. The story had already evolved beyond facts. At one point, a former industry assistant posted a vague comment referencing how things actually work behind casting doors, which immediately went viral. No names were mentioned, but context wasn't necessary anymore. Everything was being interpreted through the lens of Michael B. Jordan's statement. That is how modern Hollywood narratives function. They don't stay attached to origin. They spread through association. Meanwhile, Michael B. Jordan himself disappeared from public view again. No interviews. No appearances. No clarification beyond the initial statement. It was almost as if he had said everything he intended to say in one controlled burst and then stepped back to observe the reaction. That absence only intensified curiosity. Because in entertainment culture, silence after controversy is rarely seen as resolution. It is seen as anticipation. And anticipation demands continuation. Behind the scenes, insiders described an unusual level of caution across multiple studios. Projects that involved either Michael B. Jordan or Lori Harvey were reportedly being reassessed for scheduling alignment, a phrase that in industry language often means internal uncertainty without public acknowledgement. But the most interesting shift was not professional. It was relational. People who had previously been loosely connected to both names began distancing themselves from being associated with either narrative. Not out of fear, but out of unpredictability. Nobody wanted to be positioned inside a story they couldn't control. That is one of Hollywood's most unspoken rules. Association is currency, but only when the value is stable. Once volatility enters, association becomes risk. As for Lori Harvey, her next public appearance was minimal. A brief, controlled sighting at a private event where cameras were limited and access was tightly managed. There were no statements, no interviews, no engagement with circulating narratives. But observers noted something subtle. Her presence was unchanged. Composed. Unreactive. Almost deliberately neutral, as if she had decided not to participate in the external version of her own story. And that, in itself, became part of the story. Because in modern celebrity culture, even refusal to react is interpreted. Weeks passed. The intensity of the initial wave began to fade, but the narrative did not disappear. It transformed. From immediate shock to long-term discussion. From breaking revelation to industry case study. From personality focus to systemic debate. People stopped asking what Michael B. Jordan meant specifically. They started asking what he represented. Was he exposing something real? Was he reacting emotionally? Was he initiating a broader critique of how Hollywood constructs visibility? Or was it simply a moment where personal experience and industry complexity collided in a way that became public too fast to control? There were no definitive answers. And that uncertainty is exactly what kept the story alive longer than usual. Eventually, Michael B. Jordan was briefly seen again in a completely unrelated context, attending a private screening without media access. He did not address the previous controversy. He did not avoid it either. He simply existed outside of it, as if acknowledging that once something is released into public interpretation, it no longer belongs to the person who said it. Lori Harvey continued her work in parallel, maintaining distance from commentary entirely. No responses. No corrections. No engagement. Just controlled presence. And slowly, the industry did what it always does. It moved forward. Not because anything was resolved, but because attention shifted elsewhere. New stories emerged. New controversies formed. New narratives replaced old ones. But the Michael B. Jordan and Lori Harvey situation never fully disappeared. It remained archived in the background of Hollywood discourse as one of those moments where silence, speech, and interpretation collided without ever fully aligning. Some people still believe Michael B. Jordan exposed something significant. Others believe it was exaggerated perception. Others believe the truth lies somewhere in between and was never fully articulated to begin with. But the most accurate takeaway might be simpler. In Hollywood, stories rarely end. They dissolve into larger systems, where clarity is less important than momentum, and where every statement becomes part of a narrative that continues evolving long after the speaker has stopped speaking. And that is exactly what happened here. A single conversation became a chain reaction. A chain reaction became a discourse. And the discourse became another reminder that in this industry, perception is never stable, and silence is never empty. It is always full of interpretation. And as the cameras moved on to the next breaking moment, this story quietly settled into the category Hollywood reserves for everything it cannot fully explain but also cannot fully forget. Not resolved. Not denied. Just absorbed into the system that created it in the first place. And that is where it ends for now. And just like that, the story doesn't really end, it just gets quieter. Because in Hollywood, silence is never the final chapter. It's just the space before the next headline explodes. Michael B. Jordan may have stepped out of the studio that night, but the ripple effect of his words is still moving through every corner of the industry. Some call it truth finally being spoken out loud. Others call it misunderstanding amplified by timing.